I quote, "We have a growing concern for the safety and security of our members, our airlines, and the traveling public due to the government shutdown. This is already the longest government shutdown in the history of the United States, and there is no end in sight. In our risk-averse industry, we cannot even calculate the level of risk currently at play, nor predict the point at which the entire system will break. It is unprecedented. This is unconscionable. Mr. President, you took credit for this shutdown. You said you would accept the responsibility. You said you own this shutdown. Are you going to own and take responsibility for the loss of lives, for a catastrophe that will be caused in the sky because you're holding the American people hostage for a political agenda that has no credibility whatsoever? I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New York seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Madam Speaker, it is time to end this shutdown, which is hurting working Americans and damaging the overall economy. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce says that the shutdown is harming the American people, American business, and the economy. So far, it has cost the United States economy about a half percentage point of overall economic growth. That's about $25 billion. J.P. Morgan Chase estimates that the shutdown is now reducing economic output up to $10 billion each week. Even the administration has doubled its estimate of the economic costs. It says that if the shutdown lasts through March, we could have zero growth this quarter. Some forecasters even project that growth could turn negative. Mr. President, open this government for the people. The people are hurting. Enough is enough.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
I ask for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Mr. President, America is in crisis. What will it take for you to reopen the government? Will it take families across America to not get their tax return? Will it take federal employees going without a second paycheck or without health care? Will it take millions of families who are going hungry without SNAP, without food assistance? Maybe it'll take Customs and Border Patrol walking off the job, or uninspected planes falling from the sky due to mechanical failure or worse. I have here a letter from Doug Lowe, one of my constituents who is an aviation specialist. And he talks about how these planes aren't even being inspected right now. Or we're even worse, for all your bragging about the economy, we could be going into a recession in what would otherwise be a boom period. So I ask again, President Trump, what will it take? What disaster will it take for you to reopen this government now?
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise today on behalf of federal employees in my district and around the nation. For over a month now, 800,000 Coast Guardmen, TSA agents, and air traffic controllers have been held hostage by President Trump's shutdown, a shutdown with far-reaching consequences. Due to staffing shortages at the Dallas's 2 major airports have resulted in shortages from the TSA agents being forced to live the last 34 days without pay. Aviation experts have warned that flying today is less safe than over a month ago. Madam Speaker, since President Trump irresponsibly shut government down, I've heard from countless TSA agents and the National Air Traffic Controllers in my district. They have all indicated that while they are committed to their duties, they're also suffering financially and need the government reopened now. I stand with them. Every member of our caucus are standing together, calling on the White House to open the government now. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I also rise to share a shutdown story from my district in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Vanessa Thomas, a resident of St. Thomas, shared a heartfelt story with me on her personal experience with the government shutdown. In 2017, less than 2 years ago, she lost her home in the 2 hurricanes that we had. Her home insurance is through the USDA Rural Development Program. Prior to the shutdown, she did not receive homeowners insurance payments regularly. Now, with the shutdown, she is forced to use her own money to pay for materials and labor to repair her home. She has to choose between having her daughter sit out a semester in college or to saving her home. This is one among many stories that are threatening residents of our country. Today, I strongly urge the President to end this shutdown now, immediately. Today, we cannot continue using federal employees and federal funds as pawns in a political game. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to address the devastating impacts this shutdown is having on families throughout Oklahoma's 5th District. Over the Martin Luther King holiday weekend, I went back to my district and visited with impacted federal workers. The stories of the impacts were heartbreaking. And one of the things that stuck with me was speaking with a woman named Tammy, who reminded me that it is not just the government that is shuttered right now, but families' lives who are being shattered. And that is too often the forgotten part of this conversation. We should never use federal employees, contractors, or their families as pawns in a political disagreement. So while we are analyzing the current negative effects of this shutdown, we also need to look at the long-lasting effects on families, on our communities, and the economy. Simply put, we will be suffering the negative consequences of this shutdown for years to come. And the stories I have heard from Oklahoma families are the reasons I will continue to work to reopen the government. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition? No?
Consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Speaker. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I rise following our 11th vote earlier today to reopen government and end the senseless chaos and the pain of this shutdown. Why won't the Republicans take yes for an answer? Why won't they provide relief for the hardworking Americans suffering in their own communities? Important to note, Madam Speaker, that on every occasion we have presented to the floor initiatives that have been passed by the Republicans. In the Senate, just their own bills, sending them back to them and they have said no, or their bills acted upon by a bipartisan group in the House, our most recent contribution to send over to the Senate, and they have said no. And today, in the simplest of resolutions, we said, please vote yes for $12 billion for disaster assistance. We all know that we have to do that. And 2 weeks. Open up the government for 2 weeks in order to have a discussion of how best to protect our borders. And they said no. $12 billion for disaster assistance, 2 weeks of opening up government. to allow the debate to continue while people who can come to work and those who are working already, all of them can be paid. Americans like Brenda from Maine, whose family can no longer pay for heating, for fuel this winter, while temperatures remain below freezing. Americans like Julie from rural Iowa, who says that farmers already are hit hard by tariffs, will feel the squeeze even more now. Americans like Sarah from Colorado, whose new job at the VA is on hold, adding to wait times for veterans who need health care services. And may say of veterans who compose nearly a third of our federal workforce, 31%. Our veterans who have security clearances, who are at risk, which are at risk when you can lose your security clearance if you lose your credit rating. And you can lose your credit rating if you cannot pay your bills on time, your mortgage, your rent, your car payment, your credit card bills, and the rest. Credit rating goes down, the vulnerability of your security clearance goes down, is increased. So it is harmful to our veterans to be doing this, and it's important for everyone to know how they are affected, because our veterans who have donned the uniform of our country to protect us and then carry on their commitment to public service in the public sector as federal employees, in some ways still continuing to protect us, in other ways meeting our needs in another way. All of them affected by this shutdown. Or like Lily from Georgia, who says food stamp recipients will go hungry, many will lose subsidized housing, state and local services will be overwhelmed trying to make up for the losses. As one woman, Vivian from Maine, asked, how is a wall more important than families? The senseless shutdown shows the American people's safety and security is in peril. This week, FBI agents released a report warning of dire effects of the shutdown on nearly every aspect of their work. They write, the FBI writes, we don't need funds to get drugs and guns off the, we don't have funds to get drugs and guns off the street and to prosecute the violent gang and drug traffickers. We aren't able to take child sexual exploitation cases to grand juries to seek indictments and warrants in order to get our most violent offenders arrested. This just puts our children in jeopardy. We have no funds to pay sources that provide cybersecurity intelligence to protect the country against our foreign adversaries. And they conclude, the fear during this disastrous shutdown is our enemies know they can run freely. The FBI talked about children, putting our children in jeopardy. This shutdown is putting so many children in the families of our federal workers in jeopardy as well. Those of us who have had the privilege of serving those in food lines and the rest, to listen and hear their stories, can tell you firsthand that this is taking an impact that is material for sure. It's about their financial security, but psychological as well. We're doing serious damage to our country, totally unnecessarily. The president and the Republicans either do not notice or do not care about the real effects of this shutdown on real people. They say, oh, you'll get paid later. Well, they have to pay their bills on time and not sometime later. This morning, when told that many federal workers were going to food banks, Treasury Secretary Wilbur Ross said, I don't quite understand why. As hundreds of thousands of workers are about to miss a second paycheck tomorrow. Secretary Ross does not know why people without a paycheck have to go to food lines. This Marie Antoinette attitude of let them eat cake is pervasive in the administration. The president thinks, I guess they can call their dads for money. Hours after Secretary Ross made his statement, White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow doubled down on this administration's let them eat cake attitude, saying that the shutdown was just a glitch. Just a glitch? Maybe to you it's a glitch, but it's a paycheck to America's our federal employees and the work they do for us. So they are being harmed by not getting paid. The people they serve, the American people, are being harmed by not being served. Our economy will suffer a downturn. It does at these times. The president's own economic advisors can tell them that. This shutdown is not a glitch. It is a crisis that the president alone created and that the president alone can end. The Republicans in the Congress have been accomplices to the president's irresponsibility and just ignoring the consequences of his actions. Either he doesn't know or he doesn't care. But nonetheless, the Trump shutdown goes on. Once again, we call on the president and the Republicans in Congress, especially in the United States Senate, where they're holding this up, to reopen government now for the sake of the health, the safety, and the well-being of the American people. And I thank our federal employees for what they do to meet the needs of the American people, for the role they play in providing the public sector promise that we make to people to meet their needs, to provide the services of the courts, the protections of our security in terms of the FBI, of TSA, of the Coast Guard. Because of this shutdown, the Coast Guard are the only defense entity that are not being paid. Because this is a 25% shutdown, 75% of the workforce is at work. The Department of Defense is at work. But the Department of Homeland Security is not, and that's where the Coast Guard, that's what the Coast Guard falls under. Imagine those responsible for search and rescue in emergency situations having to go to food banks to get food for their families. How does that keep them as strong as they can possibly be? As strong as they can possibly be to search and rescue and to protect us. They are a line of defense in securing our borders. A lot of the discussion is about secure borders. Well, our borders extend to the seas. And our Coast Guard are our line of defense there. And in our proposals for the opening up of government, we have funding for our Coast Guard for assets that they have asked us for. So this is it's a tragedy in so many respects. It shouldn't go on any longer. We should at least be able to discuss and compare the merits of our different proposals. And we should be able to do that with government open and not holding the American people hostage, federal employees hostage, the security of our people hostage as well, and the safety and well-being of our children hostage to an idle campaign applause line that the president seems committed to at this time. With that, Madam Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2019, the gentlewoman from Maine, Ms. Pingree, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased we're able to be here tonight to have an hour with some of my colleagues to continue this conversation about the hardships people are facing due to this shutdown and the impact it's having on our country. We've had so many interesting stories and tragic recollections of exactly what people are going through, and as our Speaker Pelosi just said, we're holding federal employees hostage, we're holding the safety of our country hostage, we're holding the American people hostage, and it's time to get the government going again and resolve our differences. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the subject of my special order.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So today is the 34th day of the longest government shutdown in history. It's a shutdown that has no excuse and has taken a great toll on dedicated public servants and their families across America. Americans who have jobs are actually standing in line at food pantries here in Washington and back home in my state of Maine. This chamber, as of today, has voted 11 times to fund the government, to pay 800,000 workers, and to restart essential services. President Trump's unwillingness to reopen the government is tone deaf to the financial circumstances of working Americans. Most are living paycheck to paycheck and pay mortgages and health care premiums and need to keep food on the table. Government workers and contractors cannot afford these weeks being held hostage. People who rely on government programs like SNAP and housing vouchers are feeling the stress. They cannot afford these weeks of being held hostage. Businesses that are losing opportunities to expand and grow their businesses cannot afford these 3 weeks of being hostage. The consequences of this shutdown have rippled through our state and national economies. Members of Maine's Coast Guard, who protect us every single day, are about to miss their second paycheck while actively serving to protect our working waterfronts. The USDA's partial closure in Maine has put Maine farmers in a financial limbo, and SNAP benefits for Maine's most vulnerable are on the verge of a lapse. Many of Maine's craft brewers, who added $260 million to our state economy of last year, have had to put new products in their businesses on hold. At this time, I just want to share a few of the stories about what's happening and what we're hearing from our constituents in Maine as a result of this shutdown. I'll read just a few clips from letters I've received, the stories Mainers have shared with the local news, and I'll outline some of the broader problems this historic shutdown has created for real people. We've heard from a brewery in the process of expanding to a second location. They've had all their paperwork in, and the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade with the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau in the Department of Treasury when the shutdown began. But now that brewer's waiting with an empty storefront. Another brewery is just waiting for approval to open 6 new types of beer, all sitting and ready to be sold. As the owner says, January is already a tough time in Maine, as I hope you know, and to lose out on weeks of sales because of this shutdown may cause us to close our doors. Please, I implore you, do what you can to get the shutdown over with. And we hear from a lot of federal employees in our state. Here's one that says, please do whatever you can to reopen the government. I have 28 years of federal service and do not appreciate my financial security being jeopardized by the president. Another says, please do everything you can to help end the government shutdown. As a furloughed federal employee, the anxiety of not knowing when or if I'll be paid grows with every day of the shutdown. I have savings to cover a few months of living expenses, but I know many in this situation don't. We just want to get back to work, and we don't want to be used as pawns. Another says, I'm exempted from furlough, and I'm mandated to work without pay. This shutdown is crushing me. I'm a single father of 3 who just went from a 1-income household to a no-income household. I keep hearing the president insist that federal workers support this. I must have missed that poll. No one has asked me for my input. Please help end this shutdown soon. This is not sustainable for me. Another says, this shutdown is the worst one that I've been involved with since joining the federal government decades ago. Earlier this week, I went to my credit union to take out a personal loan to pay my bills. It's the first time ever in my life I've had to do that. Another says, I work under a government contract, and I've just been informed that I cannot come back to work until this government shutdown is over. This is a terrible time of year for myself and my fellow coworkers to not know when we can continue our work. Not that there is ever a good time for a shutdown. Well, the good news is I have a lot more stories like this, but I want to share some of the time with my colleagues, and I will get back to reading them more. So I want to yield some time to Ms. Underwood from Illinois. Ohio?
Thank you.
Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This week we voted for the 10th time to end the shutdown. For people in the 14th District of Illinois, the effects of this Trump shutdown are real and they are painful. This weekend, I visited a family shelter for survivors of domestic violence that does incredible work serving my community. This shelter would like to expand to serve even more people, but funding uncertainty around reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act make that impossible for them. Domestic violence survivors are a casualty of this shutdown. This weekend, I also met an entrepreneur who is working to open a pet care company with her husband. He even left his job so that they could realize their dream. But they're currently waiting on a small business administration loan they need to open their business. It's sitting on a furloughed worker's desk. Entrepreneurs are a casualty of the shutdown. This week, I met with air traffic controllers in my district, people who keep passengers and freight moving safely through the skies. They are working 6-day weeks and about to miss a second paycheck. They told me they look after their colleagues by asking, "How long do you have left?" How long do they have left before they miss a mortgage payment, a health care bill, or max out their credit cards? These are hard-working, responsible people, many with at least 3 months savings, but they're entering their second month without a paycheck. The financial and psychological stress of this shutdown is cruel, and sadly, it won't be the only consequence. The shutdown has closed the Air Traffic Controller Training Academy, which will diminish the pipeline of people we need to keep air travel safe and efficient in the future. Our future is a casualty of the Trump shutdown. Madam Speaker, I sincerely hope our Republican colleagues will join us in reopening the government. The alternative is too painful for too many. I yield back my time.
Well, thank you very much for your thoughts, and I'm happy to yield whatever time he'd like to speak to my friend from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Well, and I thank my friend from Maine. And this subject is so serious and so infuriating because it's absurd. We have shut down our government. We're like the only country in the world that does something like this and inflict harm on our employees, on Americans, and on America. We've had a gentlelady I see here from Virginia is in the chambers. She talked about national security being placed at risk. The fact that we've done this to ourselves is really difficult, and I would just say to the President, Madam Speaker, that it's time to reopen this government. We've offered 11 versions of how to reopen the government. But I want to talk about some stories because the psychological effect that the gentlelady from Maine talked about really has an impact on these employees. And I want to talk about a young man who works for the National Park Service. He's in the Natural Resource Technical Division. So what he does is he goes to the national parks and deals with faults and different kinds of geological problems that may exist. And they work throughout the year, but particularly at the time when the parks are not very crowded. And this is something that is very important. He's worked for the Park Service for 19 years, and then all of a sudden, he believes that nobody saw this coming, and he's furloughed with young children. And he described it as this: doesn't know when we're going to get back to normal. Everything's on hold. It just sucks. The mental side is crushing. I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm demoralized. And this sitting around just twiddling your thumbs, hoping that the greatest nation on earth opens back up for business, eats away at my soul. He's got a brother-in-law that works for the Border Patrol. He is an EMT and a field agent with 4 children. He's a first responder not getting paid. And this gentleman, we ask him to provide border security, and he's not getting paid, and he's under the pressure of having a young family that needs these paychecks and needs stability and reliability. We had folks from the Fish and Wildlife that came in and talked to us. Deals with aquatic and invasive species like the zebra mussel, which really can gum up water systems throughout the country. There was a big conference of Canada and the Western United States. That got canceled. When in fact we should be making sure these rivers and our waterways are in good shape. They're getting affected. There are so many things. We talk about the front-facing individuals that talk to the public, the TSA, the FBI, those individuals, but we have so many other employees who provide service to each and every one of us that are either working without pay or have been furloughed without any end in sight. This is no way to run a nation. We know that. The absurdity of all of this is really taking hold, and it's time for us to open this government. This can be resolved quickly, Mr. President. Let's just get this government open, and then let's sit down and negotiate all of this. With that, I'd yield back to my friend from Maine.
Thank you, and thank you for taking the time to share those stories with us. It's so important that everybody understand the impact this is having in many areas that most people don't know anything about. I'm happy to yield whatever time she'd like to the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. McCollum.
I thank the gentlelady for Maine for organizing this. Madam Speaker, right now millions of Americans all across this country are struggling and they're uncertain about the future because of a government shutdown. Federal employees, government contractors, and their families, they are all hurting. Small businesses, nonprofits, state, local governments, they are feeling the pain. And they know they cannot count on Congress and the federal government as a reliable partner. So who's at fault for this responsible, negligent, and dangerous shutdown? President Trump and the Republicans. They're demanding a wall the Republican majority refused to fund for 2 years. And they're willing to inflict pain on millions of Americans, damage our economy, and put our nation at risk to get their way, all so the president can keep a campaign promise. Mr. Trump and the Republicans in Congress have taken 800,000 federal workers hostage, and their demand for ransom for them is to get back to work. Well, if they want to get back to work and get paid, the ransom is Trump's wall. Last week, I met with over 40 federal employees, air traffic controllers, TSA agents, prison guards, all forced to work without pay. I met with federal workers from HUD and the IRS and the Agriculture Department who are furloughed and without pay. They are struggling. They feel betrayed by their government. They feel betrayed by their president. Tomorrow, these valued workers will miss their second paycheck. They're hurting. They feel desperate. Their families are hurting, and they feel afraid. They are being treated like pawns by this president, and it's just outright cruel. House Democrats have passed appropriation bills 10 times to fund and immediately open the government, but Republicans keep voting no. It's time for Congress and Democrats to vote to open the government and to end this shutdown. Then we can negotiate the details of a comprehensive border security and immigration reform with the government open. Every federal worker on the job or at home, I want you to know you are valued for your service and your contribution to the safety and security and to the success of our nation. You deserve to be treated with respect. You deserve to get paid immediately. And the one way that we can collectively thank them for their service is to open the government now. And I yield back to the gentlewoman from Maine and thank her again for the time.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing those stories. Mr. Perlmutter, did you?
Well, if the gentlelady would yield.
I'm happy to yield.
I have
more time.
Yeah, I want to talk about Tom who is a 32-year federal employee, works as an agricultural statistician. He calculates how many cattle are in the western United States and how many acres of hay and crop that we have. This is his 4th government shutdown. He loves his job and his work. He loves serving our country, but feels like these political games have become an insult, and he is tired of being used as a pawn. I have many more stories, but I see that the gentleman from Maryland is ready to go, and I'd yield back to the gentlelady from Maine so that she can yield to the gentleman from Maryland.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone here tonight to provide the diversity of stories that are really coming from states across the country, which we all represent. And I know it's just a small bit of what we're all hearing every day in our offices. So I'm pleased to yield time to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin.
Ms. Pingree, thank you so much for your leadership. Mr. Perlmutter, thank you for your leadership. And I welcome all questions from you guys and any other colleagues here and from any Republicans present. Anybody wants to pose a question to me, I'm all for it. Madam Speaker, Laura Trump, who's President Trump's daughter-in-law and re-election campaign advisor, recently had a message for the furloughed workers and people working without pay. It'll all be worth it, she assures us. Quote, "Listen, it's not fair to you, and we all get this, but this is so much bigger than any one person," she said in an interview with Bold TV. "It's a little bit of pain, but it's going to be for the future of our country." No, this is not a little bit of pain. A little bit of pain is losing your earring at the White House Christmas party. That's a little bit of pain. This is a lot of pain that the American people are experiencing right now. It's day 34, and tens of thousands of my constituents are suffering because of the shutdown. Military veteran air traffic controllers in Frederick County being forced to work with no pay and having to borrow money from their kids' 529 college accounts with a 10% penalty in order to put food on the table and to pay their mortgage. FDA workers living in Bethesda sent home from the job with no pay when they're supposed to be keeping our food supply safe from E. coli, salmonella, and insect infestation. Dozens of scientists, researchers, secretaries, technicians, park rangers, IT workers, all thrust into a nightmare of closed offices, closed daycare, no gross pay, no net pay, and a suffering economy. There are thousands of private contract employees in my district, Madam Speaker, who've not earned $1 in a month, and they're never going to get repaid for it. There are Uber drivers telling me they're making 1/3 of what they usually make because our regional economy is depressed in Maryland, Virginia, and DC because of the government shutdown. And we know that that's symptomatic of what's going on across the country because more than 80% of federal workers don't live in the national capital region. One of my constituents has been a federal employee for 27 years, first in the Interior Department and then in the National Park Service, who says, "This is the first time that I've had to question whether I made the right choice in public service, and the first time I've had to reach into my retirement funds to make sure that my wife and I can pay our bills as they come due this week and next." He describes fellow Park Service employees living lives of quiet desperation. And of course they would be, because they're being maligned and typecast by the President of the United States, who derides all of the federal workers as Democrats. He says they're all Democrats. Well, first of all, it's not true, but what difference does it make? They are Americans. We used to have presidents of the United States who stood with all Americans, not with those from a particular political party, not just with those who agreed with the president or showed blind loyalty to the president. We used to have presidents who were loyal to the American people and to our Constitution. All are suffering, my constituent writes, mostly silently, not looking for pity, but just for Congress and the White House to do their job. Now, we might think this shutdown is some kind of freak outburst by an admittedly erratic and impetuous president. But Madam Speaker, I represent tens of thousands of federal workers, and I'm afraid that there's a method to this madness, and I know what it is. Because I was there in January 2017 when the president issued an executive order freezing all federal hiring, demoralizing and even crippling agencies throughout our government. I was there when they adopted in January of 2017 the Holman Rule, giving Congress the power to reduce federal worker salaries and even abolish their positions simply by slipping riders into appropriations bills. I watched them try to ban the use of the words climate change by federal scientists in official documents, and I saw them propose hundreds of billions of dollars in cuts to federal worker wages and health benefits. I saw the president in September of last year announce his decision to rescind modest across-the-board statutory pay increases and locality pay increases of 1.9% for the federal workforce, and I've watched them try to bust the federal worker unions by making it easier to fire federal employees and trying to undo the existing collective bargaining contracts, a series of moves that were fought by the AFGE and NTEU and were finally reversed in court. Madam Speaker, the original political philosopher of this administration, Steve Bannon, told us very clearly what was the principal and overriding political aim of this administration when he essentially declared war on our government and its workforce. He stated at the outset of the administration that the new administration is in an unending battle for deconstruction of the administrative state. Every day it is going to be a fight, he said. And by the administrative state, he means my constituents who are working to protect our air, protect our water, protect our planet and the climate at the EPA, at NOAA, and throughout the federal government. He means the civil servants at the Department of Justice who are prosecuting mobsters and white-collar criminals, the IRS agents who are trying to catch tax scofflaws and collect money so we have a government. He means the people at NOAA who are trying to save us from the horrors of ocean acidification, the collapse of the glaciers, and the cataclysmic weather events that have overtaken us in the age of global warming. He means the hardworking scientists and researchers at the NIH who are working to cure colon cancer and breast cancer, cystic fibrosis and multiple sclerosis, and even malignant narcissistic personality disorder. Madam Speaker, does America recognize what's happening to us? We have a president who has essentially declared war on our own government, on our own civil service. This is a complete betrayal of the oath of office. He is sworn to uphold and defend the law, not to frustrate and thwart it. The first paragraph of the Constitution creates a covenant to form a more perfect union. But the president has given us the longest shutdown in American history. He's driving a wedge through the union to establish justice. But they've defunded the Department of Justice to ensure domestic tranquility. But the Department of Homeland Security is not being funded, and our border and patrol agents are being forced to work with no pay to provide for the common defense. But our Coast Guard officers have been held hostage along with the rest of the federal workforce to promote the general welfare. But 800,000 federal workers are being forced to work with no pay or sent home from jobs that the American people desperately want them to do. And to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, but instead we are now threatening to bequeath to our children a dysfunctional government, degraded regulatory capacity to clean our air and water, a chaotic and unequal economy, and a comprehensive climate disaster. And who wins? Who benefits? Who profits from it? Well, we know it's not the American people. The overwhelming number of American people in every poll say, open up the government right now. Put the federal workers back to work. And it's not the federal workforce, which has been put through hell over the last month. It's not the business community, which is suffering. It's none of us who's benefiting because the whole economy is hurting. But Donald Trump has a profound admiration for autocrats and kleptocrats, tyrants and dictators all over the world. Putin in Russia, Orban in Hungary, Duterte in the Philippines, the homicidal crown prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. All of these are the heroes of the president. And it must be a delicious sight for them to see as the president dismantles the government of our own country. They don't shut down the government in Russia. They're not shutting down the government in Hungary. They're not shutting down the government in the Philippines, but he has shut down our own government. Who wins? Who benefits from this outrageous and scandalous offense against America? Well, it's not a partisan issue. I think the American people are increasingly unified every day against this horror. And now we have the first great Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, who unified America by working to save the Union and defend the government. And now we've got a Republican president who's driving a wedge through the Union and has closed the government down. Will that be his legacy? Will this disgraceful offense against our Constitution and government be the legacy of this president? Or will somehow someone get to the president and tell him that our people are hurting? It's not a little bit of pain. And I know they can't understand why federal workers are going to food banks. Then they should come on out to the food banks. I invite them to come join me at the food banks in my district where I've been going. You will meet lots of federal workers and their families there. Because in this economy, there are a lot of people who are living from paycheck to paycheck. And tomorrow, that's 2 paychecks that people have missed. And they've missed them in the course of not doing the jobs that America needs them to do. So I want to thank Ms. Pingree for yielding this time, and I just urge all of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle and the president to please let America get back to work and to open the government immediately. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Maryland, and I know it's particularly challenging in a district where so many people are close to Washington and so many federal employees have, a multitude of challenges. So I appreciate your good work and your thoughts. And I want to yield a little time to my friend and colleague from Alabama, Ms. Sewell.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I rise today in solidarity with the over 800,000 federal workers and contractors who are dramatically impacted by the shameful and irresponsible government shutdown. I rise today to share the stories of those federal workers in my district, Alabama's 7th Congressional District. This shutdown is impacting everyone. I had the pleasure recently of going through the Montgomery Airport and the Birmingham Airport in my district. It was Martin Luther King's Day, and everybody was trying to be upbeat. But it is really hard to be upbeat when you miss a paycheck. It's hard to be upbeat when you have bills to pay and you don't know how you're going to make ends meet. We celebrated Martin Luther King's birthday on Monday, and it was King who said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Well, Madam Speaker, it is a threat to justice that people work without pay in this country, in America. It is an injustice that they're about to miss the 2nd paycheck. It is unacceptable that we are not doing our job so that the people who are working without pay can get paid. We have to do better. We must reopen government. Enough is truly enough. Today, my staff delivered food to the Federal Bureau of Prisons in Aliceville, Alabama, in Pickens County, to the hundreds of workers that work there every day and who have not gotten paid in 35 days. They did so out of service. But you know what? We, out of obligation, must open up this government so that everyone who is working gets paid and all those that are furloughed can go back to work. We know the importance of dignity of a job. And these are hardworking federal workers and contractors that deserve to get paid. Why are we holding them hostage? Why is their paychecks held hostage? All for a wall. I want to be clear, Madam Speaker. We Democrats believe in border security, but we want effective border security. I do not believe that spending $5.7 billion for a wall when people in my district, babies in my district, go to bed hungry. When there are people in my district who need basic water and sewer in Lowndes County and in Pickens County and in Perry County, Alabama, I will stand up and fight for all those in my district. And I stand in solidarity with my federal workers and contractors. They deserve to get paid. I had an opportunity to talk with a young TSA worker from Birmingham, Alabama, just on Tuesday. I pass through that airport once a week, coming to and fro to D.C. And this young worker with a smile on her face said, "How are you this morning? Can I help you?" And I said, "How can I help you? I want you to know that we're working hard every day to open up government." She goes, "I know that. I know that you are." I also know that a wall will not make the difference. You know, the sad irony is that so many of these federal workers don't have savings. She told me that she was just happy to have a job with the federal government, to have the security of having a federal job is what she said. She also told me that right now things are okay because she has her mother to take care of her child. She can no longer afford to send her child to daycare and put gas in her car to drive to the Birmingham airport to work at 4 a.m. in the morning, that first shift. But she does it. She does it as long as she can. And we have to stand on this floor and demand that we reopen government as long as we can, as long as they have not gotten their paychecks. It's unfair. It is an injustice. It is an injustice. So today, many of my congressional staff are with those correctional officers in Aliceville, Alabama. We heard the story of Heather Bryant, who is struggling to pay for the gas she needs to drive the 30 minutes to work. You see, in this small community of Aliceville, Alabama, the Federal Women's Correctional Facility is the major employer. It is the major employer in that city, in that county. And I want you to know that because of the 35 days that these correction officers, parole officers, prison workers have gone without pay, that we have seen restaurants close. We have seen convenience stores reduce hours in that community. Indeed, in order for us to provide meals today, we had to reopen that Meat and Three diner in order to feed these workers today. This is unacceptable because it's not just the federal workers that are impacted. It's a collateral damage that's done to the communities around this country. Store owners, restaurant owners who depend upon those workers for their livelihoods are affected. We must do something now. It is unfair for us to ask those folks who are furloughed to come back to work and not get paid. It is unfair and unjust for us to ask federal workers who are working hard every day in our airports, in our prison systems, all across this nation to work without pay. But as Martin Luther King also said, the time is always ripe to do what is right. And what is right, Madam Speaker, is to reopen government now. We must stand with these federal workers. We must unabashedly demand that they get paid. And we must seek ways to work across the aisle to get government open. But they have to also offer an olive branch. This president hasn't done that. Instead, he's put his interests over the American people's interests. Enough is enough. We must reopen government and let our federal workers, our contractors know that we stand in solidarity with them. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much to Ms. Sewell from Alabama. Happy to give whatever time she would like to Ms. Schakowsky from Illinois.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to come down and talk. Our colleague from Alabama was talking about Martin Luther King, who also talked about the urgency of now. If there's a time for urgency, it is now to end the shutdown and pay the workers. He also talked about and warned about that if you wait too long, it can be too late. So this is the time to spare what is a growing disaster for all Americans from happening. Wilbur Ross, our Commerce Secretary, said that he doesn't quite understand why these furloughed and unpaid workers might have to go to a food bank. He doesn't understand. That is exemplary of the level at which this administration is completely tone deaf and out of touch. That they don't understand how people, the beginning salary for a TSA worker at the airport is $28,000. And sometimes it goes up to maybe $43,000. Tomorrow will be the second week, the second paycheck that they don't get. So a number of us in Chicago had a roundtable that included 8 members of the House of Representatives, Democrats, and Senator Durbin, Madam Chair right now, Madam Speaker in the chair, was at that roundtable. And we heard from 18 different workers from different agencies talking. And Wilbur Ross ought to talk to Florence, who is helping people get food stamps and found herself having to apply for food stamps for the SNAP program. And she waited 3 hours at a food bank. Why? Because the lines are growing and growing and growing of people who, yes, Secretary Ross, need to get food on their tables and can't afford to do it. Shame on you for not understanding what's going on out there. We are hearing people giving blood and plasma in order to have a few dollars to put food on the table. We're hearing about people running out of gas money because, and that means that they can't get to work. This is money that comes out of their pocket while they are not getting paychecks. This president, Mitch McConnell, who won't even, doesn't want to call bills that would actually get the government going, shame on you. Shame on you, Wilbur Ross. Shame on this administration. This is a crisis. This is a disaster that you're creating. You can end it. So the demand is clear, and the shutdown, pay the workers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you for hosting a roundtable in your district. I think every time we get a chance to have people gather to talk about this, at least they know we're listening to them, even if we haven't fixed the problem. I'm happy to yield whatever time he would like to use to Mr. Soto from Florida.
Thank you. And thank you. I thank the gentlelady from Maine for hosting this. First, I want to start by reading a letter from one of my constituents, Douglas Lowe, who is a professional aviation safety specialist in my district. Dear Representative Soto, I am writing you with a heavy heart and much stress as I live through this government shutdown. It has been the longest we have ever faced, and as the days continue, I am finding myself more and more weakened by the situation. I am president for the Florida chapter of Professional Aviation Safety Specialists. We represent the men and women that make aviation across our nation function in every aspect, from the aviation safety inspectors to people like myself who maintain complex equipment that makes air traffic control possible, as well as a multitude of support staff that deal with logistics and contracts. The main reason I am writing you is to talk about the human factor. We need to find a resolution. There must be an end to this shutdown. Real people are suffering. Many coworkers of mine across the nation, people I represent, have come to me with hardships. I personally have dealt with 2 individuals already whom have had to resign their positions and move on with life. We are going on day 34 now with no end in sight. Men and women like myself have still been at work. Each day makes that endeavor a little harder. We struggle with when and how do we keep coming to work and support the system that we can no longer afford gas to get to. I personally have had to make some sacrifices already. This Friday, the 25th, is my daughter's 18th birthday. I have asked my daughter to please forgive me, but we are not buying her anything right now because we need to budget and ensure we have money for bills and for food. I also take care of my mother, who has schizophrenia. I have been relying 100% this past month on her nurse to hold everything together because I cannot get over to see her. The amount of stress and anxiety surrounding these events is enormous. I cannot ask enough that every member of Congress please think about those of us caught in the middle of this fight. Please consider our hardships and find some common ground. Find a road forward. I still have faith in you, and we are carrying the country on our backs, but I do not know how much longer we can endure. I'm a Marine and a leader, so I show a smile, and I keep moving forward, but I've already seen the heartache and turmoil others have displayed. People crying, not knowing how to make ends meet. Professionals applying for food stamps and aid while still being required to put in 40-hour work weeks. The list goes on and on. But I believe the most disturbing fact is that this is happening to people in the United States of America, the greatest country in the world. People are being asked and forced to work for free, threatened to completely lose their livelihood if they do not show up for work. This is something that I would expect from a country that is developing. I won't use the exact word he used. My fear is someone is going to be so stressed that they miss a task. They're going to be so fatigued that they make a mistake. And with the jobs that we do, that mistake could lead to the lives of thousands being lost. Aviation safety is on the line. And each day, each hour, each minute that we stay shut down, more risk is injected into our nation's aviation system. Please, I beg you to reopen the government before something bad happens. I continue to come to work because I think of the children that may be flying into Orlando on a Make-A-Wish Foundation flight. That child may have cancer and may be on their way to Disney for what may be the last days of their lives. I come to work each day without pay to make sure that those children land safely. But as the weeks turn into months for this shutdown, I am fearful that even I will have a breaking point. Sincerely, Douglas Lowe, Professional Aviation Safety Specialist. Now I want to talk a little bit about compromise throughout American history. You know, there have been some great American compromises that we have seen in this nation. Starting at the very founding of our republic in 1787, after we had to start working on the Constitution, Connecticut delegates Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth drafted the Great Compromise, a plan for congressional representation. Without this, there likely would have never been a constitution. Many more compromises have followed in political history, but imagine what small states would face and large states would face if they didn't have representation in the Senate and in the House. And then there was the Compromise of 1790 that was made famous by the now popular Hamilton musical. It was the compromise by Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson with James Madison, where Hamilton won the decision for the national government to take over and pay the debt and create a banking system, while Jefferson and Madison obtained a national capital in the District of Columbia that we stand in right now for the South. That was described as the room where it happens. And I feel like we need another room where it happens today. But compromises aren't always great in American history. The 19th century, in particular, we had many examples, and it was a dark time for trying to compromise on such moral crusades such as slavery and the Civil War. But I will mention one of them. In 1820, there was the Missouri Compromise, legislation that provided admission of your state, Maine, a free state, along with Missouri, that unfortunately came in as a slave state, thus maintaining the balance of power between the North and the South in the United States. So one of the things I struggle with right now is, what time are we in? Is this a time where we need to compromise and it'll turn out to be one of those terrible ones that America will look back on, like that one? Or will it be one of the ones that helped forge ahead the republic stronger than ever. In the 20th century, compromise fared far better in American politics. We saw in 1917, the United States came together to enter World War I, even though we were still emerging as a world power ourselves. But we saved our allies from destruction and turned the tide of the war and eventually emerged as a major power. But everything changed when we saw the New Deal happen. And mostly Democrats, with some Republicans, not enough of them, came together to help make sure that we would have major programs to help put Americans back to work after we had the stock market crash. But it was in December 7th, 1941, in a day that would live in infamy, where Pearl Harbor was bombed, that Democrats and Republicans came together to join in a fight against Nazi Germany and the Japanese Empire to literally rewrite the rules of the world order that we now live in today. We just, in fact, reaffirmed those with a vote the other day, affirming our support for NATO. Compromises got even better as we got into the 60s. In 1964, one of the first civil rights bills was proposed by congressional Democrats in the North and opposed by Republican senators, and led to one of the longest filibusters in Senate history. Eventually, Majority Leader Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, I believe, reached out to his Republican counterpart, Senator Everett Dirksen, to put an end to the debate, and the bill passed 9 days later. In 1977, we saw finally more regulations and more teeth into the law to protect folks who are going hungry with the Food Stamp Act. And it was Republican Bob Dole at the time. I mean, can you imagine that? Later on, along with Democratic Senator George McGovern, that joined forces to support a bipartisan compromise back in 1977. In '86, we've heard so much about in the 80s, President Reagan and Speaker Tip O'Neill being able to get together to come up with major compromises. One was to save Social Security for a future generation in 1983 to 86. Another in 86 was a tax reform bill that eventually came to a compromise, which leads me to probably the most relevant one for what we have today, which is in 2013, when a bipartisan immigration bill passed the Senate with 68 votes. It had comprehensive immigration reform and included robust border security. So the big question that each member will have to ask in the Congress, in the House, in the Senate, and among the President as well, is what are we willing to do to rise together? What sacrifices are we willing to take, and what compromises are we willing to wage, and what interests are we going to advance to come together to put an end to the longest shutdown in American history? And I can assure you it's not going to be easy, but I know that if we all work together, we can do it. But there's one thing in common with all these compromises. None of them required a government shutdown. Not a single one. We had some filibusters in there, but not one of these major compromises in American history started by a shutdown. So I think the first thing that we need to do is reopen the government, not hold our federal workers hostage over what needs to be a grand compromise on policy, on immigration, on border security. And with that, I thank the gentlelady from Maine for allowing me to have a few moments to talk about how important it is, this moment in time is, and how every member needs to step up for the American people to end this shutdown now. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman from Florida and for reminding us of so many important historic compromises. Some I liked, some I didn't, but Were it not for Missouri Compromise, we wouldn't have Maine, so I'm glad about that one anyway. And also, as you said, we can compromise without holding all of these workers who we've been talking about tonight hostage, and without shutting down the government, without shaking up people's lives. This is our challenge to work out. As members of Congress, as members of the executive branch, we can't ask our hardworking federal employees to bear the brunt of all of this. And with that, I'd like to yield some time to the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Clark, who's also the vice chair of our caucus. And thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for fitting us in your busy schedule.
Thank you. Thank you for yielding and for holding this important special order hour. It is so important that we tell the stories of the very real impact of this shutdown, and I appreciate you giving us that opportunity. I do want to share some of the stories from my district. We recently heard from Emily, who's a TSA agent at Logan Airport and a single mom of 3. She hasn't received her paycheck. She won't be getting one tomorrow, and is worried about falling behind on rent and child care payments. She has to stay current with child care or she loses her children's spots. She said, quote, "I don't know how I'm going to make this work. If I don't get paid, how can I afford to send my children to daycare?" She has $400 left in her bank account. Then there's Donna from Revere. She's been employed at her job for the last 22 years, but doesn't know where her next meal will come from without a paycheck to rely on. Donna said, "I have to choose between buying food or paying a bill." We received a call from a retired federal employee in Natick. She lives in affordable housing and is required to prove her income to renew her lease. She cannot obtain a statement from OPM regarding her pension because they are closed, jeopardizing her living situation. Sandy called us. She owns a startup in Cambridge that almost exclusively contracts with DOD and DHS. This is a small business, and they are struggling to keep up with payroll as the checks stopped coming. She said, "We have about a week and a half of payroll left." David from Ashland is an active duty Coast Guard member stationed in Boston, which I want to note, community has come together to open a food bank for our Coast Guard members and their families. And he doesn't know how he and his family are going to continue to pay their bills. The Coast Guard, certainly for coastal states and for our national security, play a critical role, not only in search and rescue, protection from terrorism, but also in drug interdiction. And the fact that we are asking Coast Guard members who serve their country proudly and with great patriotism to work without pay is a national shame. Susan from Belmont receives a housing subsidy through HUD, and if the shutdown continues, she is afraid she could face the possibility of eviction. We've heard from Amanda in Waltham. Amanda is an Indian citizen who's resided with legal status in the U.S. for over 12 years, working for a child care provider. She and her husband and young son traveled to India in November to visit with family, and at that time, they went to the U.S. consulate to get their visas stamped. Her husband's visa was issued right away, but Amanda's was subject to further review. Having not received her visa, she remains in India, separated from her son and husband. The shutdown has delayed this processing further and has prolonged the separation, which is a significant hardship on this family. These are just a few of the stories that we have heard about what is the real impact on this shutdown. It is long past time that we open government. We can negotiate on what real border security looks for, but it shouldn't be done at the expense of the security of these families and of our national security as well. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentlewoman from Massachusetts for sharing those stories, which we are hearing throughout New England and are so challenging and meaningful to all of us. We've heard tonight from, as I said earlier, we have heard from all regions of the country, north and south and east and west, and so many of these stories are the same. We've heard from families affected by the fact that our Coast Guard personnel are not being paid. The only branch of the military that doesn't get paid, and this is a hardship not only on them but on their families as well, who are home trying to make ends meet when they're off deployed. The TSA, the FAA, which we depend on every single day in our airports across the country for our safety, for our security, people who work in the federal courts, people who are not working, but are government employees. They're not essential, so they're furloughed, but they can't go out and get another job in the middle of all this. They just have to wait till it's over to collect that back pay. And so many of the contractors I hear from who can't continue with the contracts because maybe they work with the Coast Guard or other federal agencies and they can't keep the funding going and they can't give any certainty to when jobs will be completed or to their own employees. I have a couple of minutes left, and I'm going to read a long story, but it might just take up just exactly the amount of time. We talk so much about all of the employees, but there are so many others who are impacted by this, and particularly in the agriculture sector in Maine. We're very proud of our farmers. We're very proud of seeing new young farmers getting into the business, of farms being revived and finding new markets. And this was a story from the Grace Pond Farm in Thomaston. They shared their story of how the USDA shutdown has impacted them. They said, we are often a little removed from the issues affecting others. We can sigh and rejoice, cry and shake our fist in the air with just a little bit of safe distance from way up here, but not this time. This shutdown affects everyone, and that everyone includes us. We've planned and schemed and dreamed our way into this historic farm property in Thomaston. Greg and I have spent our countless late nights after catching chickens and milking cows, staring at screens and numbers, putting together business plans and spreadsheets to grow sustainably. Our goal is just to be able to milk cows, grow chickens and turkeys, feed our kids and neighbors, and drive a car that runs. Greg grew up learning how to enjoy dark mornings working on a dairy farm in rural Pennsylvania, and I grew up in central Maine, spending mornings waiting for the Skeans dairy truck and learning how to beat my brother to the cream on the top of that glass bottle. We want to ensure that both of these experiences are available to our kids and to everyone in Maine for years to come. Our farm is financed in the old-fashioned way, on a tightrope. We operate on a faith-based budget that keeps things very exciting. The FSA and USDA rural development loans are valuable resources for poor folks that want to work hard and eat well, and we make good use of them. About a year ago, with shifting dairy market impacting our current situation, we poured ourselves into the process of financing a new farm we'd found to fit our needs. Utilizing a community lender, we managed to secure that property, and relying on our faith-based budget, we went for it. Thanks to CEI for taking that chance on us. We also began the laborious process of financing the dairy infrastructure at the new property using FSA as our security lender because that's what they do for us. This is all contingent on our selling the old farm property. We cannot in any way carry two farms. After gratefully securing a buyer for the old farm, we were moments away from closing when the government was shut down. Just like that. We lost access to our mortgage holder and all of the necessary documentation and signatures that they alone can provide. Not only that, we were just a few weeks away from the deadline for our main DACF-based dairy loan and found ourselves suddenly without the proof of security necessary. No skin in the game equals no dairy loan. We are now weeks past our closing. We continue to accrue heating bills, taxes, and mortgage interest on the old farm property, while we pay all the same on the new one. We had to scramble to find another bridge loan for the dairy infrastructure, and due to the lender being anyone but the USDA, interest rate is more than 5 percentage points higher. That translates into an annual number that made our numbers guy take a few breaths before commenting when he hears the news. We are thousands of dollars into this shutdown now. We operate on razor-thin margins. We're not alone. The companies that sell us grain and chicks and poults, sorry, gotta stop that timer. Poults are actual people, employing other actual people. all operating on a faith-based budget, trying to preserve a way of life that we believe has value and merit. We need an end to the shutdown before we have to shut down the way of life that should be much more and is lost for all. Thank you so much to all my colleagues for being here tonight. Thank you to everyone who shared their stories and allowed us to let you in on a little bit of how this tragedy proceeds. And I encourage a negotiation and a settlement. Thank you, and I yield back.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the President. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2019, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to address the current government shutdown and the status of the government wall. It's kind of a frustrating issue to address because there's so much misinformation out there. The first thing I will address is the unpaid employees. We can pay the unpaid employees, particularly the employees who are working, if we would pass a bill now. We do not have to end this whole thing. There is a wonderful bill, House Bill 271, introduced by Congressman Brooks, I'm a co-sponsor, that will immediately pay all the current working federal employees. I do not have the power to put that bill on the floor because I am just a regular congressman from Wisconsin. But the majority leader, if you see him, could put that bill on the floor any time. And if the real concern here is for the federal employees who work in our airports, who work in the Coast Guard, who work in our prisons, many of which I know and are great people, if these people really cared about them, that bill would be on the floor next Tuesday and winging its way to President Trump's desk by this time next week. It is a mystery to me why, when so many politicians purport to care about the federal employees, they will not bring forth this bill to pay them without having the whole issue solved. The next issue I'm going to address is these people who say President Trump cannot compromise. I don't know whether they haven't been paying attention the last 2 years or whether they are just love to make things up. For the public to understand, under normal circumstances, if we're going to build a wall, the wall is in what we call an appropriation bill, or people back home would refer to as a budget. President Trump ran on the wall, and the wall is necessary, and we'll talk about that in a second. But nevertheless, President Trump would have wanted funding for this wall in some budget. For this first 2 years, President Trump was sent budgets by Congress, or spending bills by Congress, that did not contain a wall. That was frustrating to him, but because he did not want to shut down the government, and did not want to penalize the government employees, President Trump, particularly with a big omnibus bill about a year ago, signed big spending bills without a wall because he compromised. You will recall that originally people talked about this wall being $20 billion. President Trump is now asking for $5.7 billion. In the last week, I have taken time to meet with the former head of the Border Patrol. I have been on the Arizona border, and it disappoints the experts in the field, the people on the border themselves, that Donald Trump has compromised so much as to want only funding for a fraction of the wall. So I would say coming down from $20 billion to $5.7 billion is a big compromise. I would say twice signing entire appropriations for his first 2 years in office without the wall is a big compromise by President Trump. President Trump last Saturday also decided to extend asylum, decided to extend DACA, decided to extend temporary protected status on people. Now, what I found out from listening to the Border Patrol is that when you talk about DACA, insofar as the president talks about it, it encourages more people to come here from the south of the border because they will assume DACA is a permanent thing and that more and more people will be added to it. But despite the fact that it might have been irresponsible to talk about DACA and extending it again, President Trump, in an effort to compromise, decided to throw these other policy items in the mix on Saturday. I sometimes slip. Instead of calling President Trump the commander-in-chief, I call him the compromiser-in-chief, because he has given so much to twice sign annual bills without funding for the wall, ask for funding for the wall for only a fraction of the wall. And when I was down on the border, I saw places where the wall ended and they needed extensions. And President Trump is not asking for enough money for the extensions the Border Patrol needs. But in the interest of compromise, President Trump has asked for $5.7 billion. I will talk in a second about how much that money it is. Now, I know for me, $5.7 billion is a huge amount of money. But let's talk about what other people are willing to vote on around here. $5.7 billion for the wall is about 1/7 of what we spend every year on foreign aid. And I never hear congressmen come up here and rail against all the money we're spending against foreign aid and how we could do wonderful things if we only kept that money at home. But all of a sudden, with 1/7 the cost of foreign aid, we have a battery of people on the other side of the aisle saying we could do so much better things with that money. When in a wink of an eye, they're going to pass appropriation bills spending 7 times that much year after year after year after year on foreign aid. President Trump greatly increased the defense budget, more than I would have liked, complained about it a little bit. The funding for the wall would be about 1/12 of the increase, not the total budget, the increase in the defense budget under President Trump. Again, I objected. Almost nobody around here, however, objected to this large increase in the defense budget. But now it comes to the wall, and all of a sudden, they can't bring themselves to vote for it. Is this a crisis? You bet it's a crisis. Like I said, I was down on the border last week in Sassabee, Arizona. First of all, we have the huge cost to the governments at the border. People are coming across the border using our medical facilities. The governor of California has outright said he'll be happy to have all the immigrants. I guess everybody in the Western Hemisphere can come to California and have the government, which to a certain extent means the federal government, pay for medical costs. 90% of the heroin comes across the southern border. Now, you hear people say that most of that is at selected points of entry. But the reason most of the heroin caught is at selected points of the entry is because we're not catching virtually anybody between the points of entry. They're just walking in where there is no wall. I don't know, given the huge number of people who die of heroin every year, that we can say that not putting walls in the gaps in the current system is not something that is necessary and not something that we need to do to solve that heroin crisis. I mean, there are a lot of parts to that heroin crisis, but when that amount of heroin is coming across south of the border, part of the answer is to complete the wall. We're getting more and more children at our border. What is going on right now, so people understand, is parents are sending their children to the border. And if the children come to the border, which is all the easier because they may have somebody escort them to the border, we will take those children and deliver them to a relative around the country. I would say if a children is taking the hazardous trek, albeit helped along the way, to come to the United States, and the parents are sending the children with somebody who may not be their relative, sending their children because once the children are here, the children can say they're living in America, and the parents can come here under the family rules and join them. It is a huge crisis. Other people coming and trying to get between the points of entry are frequently found dying. I have been told, I haven't confirmed it, that in the Tucson sector alone in the last 15 or 16 years, over 2,000 people have been found dead of dehydration, starvation, what have you. That is what you call a humanitarian crisis. The overall cost on our overburdened government. Different people can argue how much illegal immigrants cost this country. The Heritage Foundation, some people may not agree with them, feel it's over $50 billion a year. When it's costing us $50 billion a year between the health care costs and the welfare costs and the education costs and the criminal justice costs, how can you not spend $5.7 billion to begin to solve this crisis? Next thing to address, it's sometimes said, and people said to my right, that everybody wants to do something about the border. I question that, given what other people are saying. It may surprise Americans out there to know that there are a lot of people out there who buy into the idea that the United States can be kind of like Europe and we can have open borders and everybody can walk wherever they want. How do we know this? All around the country we have sanctuary cities in which mayors, or sanctuary counties in which county executives, or in case of California, a whole state in which local officials are forbidden to ask people whether they are here legally or not. The only explanation for that is Americans are electing people around the country who do not believe in borders, who are perfectly happy to have tens of millions of people come across our southern border, some good, some not so good. But obviously these people do not believe in border security. If you believed in border security, the governor of California would not be openly inviting everybody to come to California for free medical care. It is clear that a lot of people out there do not want a closed border. Another piece of evidence for that is you have members of Congress saying we should get rid of ICE, get rid of immigration enforcement. People who publicly say we should get rid of immigration enforcement, even though it's a preposterous idea, of course border security is not a priority for them. They are the type of people who, on examining the situation, can see no reason why we cannot accept 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 million other illegal immigrants across the border. And by the way, one other thing I found out talking to the Border Patrol is nobody knows exactly how many illegal immigrants are in the country. You sometimes heard it said 11 million, 12 million. It could be 15 million. It could be 20 million. We really aren't counting, and the people on the Border Patrol, themselves will admit that they don't know how many people are coming across the border. Now, the next thing you hear is, oh, I care about border security, I just don't believe in the wall. Why don't I believe that? I don't believe that they really care about border security because walls work. Now, behind me, I have pictures of 4 parts of the wall or the wall in other parts of the world. Here we have a wonderful wall which cut illegal immigration by over 90% in the San Diego, Tijuana area. That wall works. I was in Nogales, Arizona, and here's a wall that was recently refurbished, and that wall works. Unfortunately, as you'll notice, the wall ends. And the Border Patrol and the ranchers near this area who live near this area, one of which I recently talked to, they all of a sudden MS-13 showed up, and they had to give them dinner at the ranch. These people desperately want this wall to be extended a little bit. Here we have more wall in Arizona, at Sassabee, Arizona. And here we have a wall that has cut illegal immigration down to almost nothing in Israel. I was not able to find a wall, which has also been successful. I got to find a picture. We'll be back next week with a picture of a wall between Jordan and Syria. You might say, why are you talking about a wall between Jordan and Syria? Because a lot of that wall was paid for by the United States. Now, why did the United States have no problem funding a wall in San Diego or a wall in Sassabee or upgrading the wall in Nogales? Many of my colleagues on the right side of me here had no problem voting for these walls. But there's something different about these walls than the wall President Trump wants. These walls were proposed by somebody other than President Trump. When it was President Clinton proposing to build a wall in San Diego, people didn't say it was immoral to have a wall. When President Obama was extending or upgrading the wall in Nogales, Arizona, people didn't say, President Obama is an immoral person, walls look bad. You never even heard about it. I didn't know about it until a couple weeks ago. When you have the wall going up in Sassabee, which desperately has to be extended, that wall was built under President Bush, under appropriation bills, not a peep. Nobody's saying it was immoral when President Bush built a wall. So now we get down to, I reluctantly conclude, because I have to wonder when you have these other successful walls around the world, when we have no problem voting for walls for Jordan, for goodness sakes, why all of a sudden, in this large budget, and every budget has even things in it we don't like, why all of a sudden do we go through all this heartburn, put all these federal employees through their financial distress? Why do we do it when we could pay, when in the past we built walls all the time? And I have to include, sadly, part of it is some people want President Trump to fail. And the fact that not building a wall means all that much more heroin across the border, that it means many more people sneaking across the border or escorted across the border by the Mexican cartels. And by the way, today, the Mexican cartels run the border. So to come in this country, it means you are hostage for a while to the Mexican cartels, which may be one of the reasons why they don't do a very good job of protecting the women down there. It's why it can be very expensive for people. It's why people who try to escort you across the border and aren't a member of the cartel, if they are caught, will be killed, and apparently in some cases skinned alive. But we don't want to stop the current situation. And again, I don't know, the folks back home will have to wonder, why can people build a wall in Jordan? Why can we let President Clinton build a wall in San Diego, which is very effective? Why can we let President Bush build a wall? Why can we let President Obama upgrade our walls? But all of a sudden, President Trump becomes president, and we got to have a shutdown because we can't vote for a budget with a wall in it. You know, I mean, I voted for spending bills under chief executives that were Democrats and Republicans, and I usually agree with the Republicans, but it never occurred to me to vote against the spending bill because I didn't like other policies of the chief executive. So here we have it. We'll refresh your memory one more time. Walls work. They work in Israel, they work in San Diego, they work in Nogales. We have paid for many walls, both in this country and in other countries, and other countries build walls, and they are successful. If we do not build a wall, we will continue to have people starve as they try to come in here inappropriately. We will continue to have bad people come across the border who commit crimes. We will continue to have people come across the border who are here for our generous welfare benefits, which is something that didn't occur to me until I got down to the border and talked to customs. And they said when you look in people's wallets and you look at people's purses, they find food stamps, EBT cards in those purses. In other words, people are coming here to get our welfare benefits. It would be much better if we completed the wall and funneled people through the normal entry points so we could keep some of the criminal element out of the country. We could people coming here just to take advantage of our generous medical systems, all the federal dollars going into this that our governor of California and mayor of New York are so eager to give away. We can solve this crisis, but all it takes is somebody to be willing to pass a budget that is too free spending otherwise, by the way. I don't like all this excessive spending in the budget. But say every budget is a compromise and we're willing to build the wall. And I hope in the interim, my colleagues, who at least are pretending now to care about the federal employees, will bring a separate bill to the floor, which they can do at any time. Wonderful bill. HB 271, Mo Brooks, great guy. Bring that bill to the floor so we can pay the Coast Guard, we can pay the guys and gals working in the federal prisons, we can pay the TSA guys. So even if you don't feel like spending anything on the wall today, at least they can get paid for the work they're doing. And you are crying crocodile tears if you do not co-sponsor those bills and bring those bills to the floor, but then claim that you have sympathy for the federal employees. We do not have to solve the other issues to get these people paid. I'd like to thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back.
I do? Oh. Okay. Thank you.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that when the House adjourns today, it adjourn to meet at 2 p.m. tomorrow, and further, when the House adjourns on that day, it adjourn to meet on Monday next, when it shall convene at noon for morning hour debate and 2 p.m. for legislative business.
Without objection.
I move that the House do now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stand adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow.